Every orc video on YouTube has the same comment somewhere in the replies. Someone drops it like they're the first person who ever thought of it. Fun fact, the orcs are actually based on people from New Jersey. It pulls hundreds of likes. Another commenter immediately fires back with something about Cockney accents and football firms. The thread spirals for 48 replies across 3 days and nobody changes their mind. Both sides are doing the same thing, recognizing something familiar in orc culture and trying to name where it comes from. The aggression, the noise, the territorial bravado, the complete inability to whisper. Yeah, there's something identifiable there. The New Jersey camp has the right instinct and the wrong continent. The British hooligans camp is closer, a lot closer. But even that framing misses the most interesting part of the answer, which is the why. Why a game design team in 1980s London specifically reached for this cultural archetype. Why it's so perfectly realized that people on the other side of the Atlantic are pattern matching it to their own working-class neighborhoods 40 years later. And why every ridiculous mechanical detail in orc lore, the red paint, the guns that work on conviction, the social structure that runs entirely on who's biggest, turns out to be deliberate, systematic satirical genius rather than random sci-fi weirdness. Before any of that, there's a piece of orc history that most videos skip, and a specific category of viewer gets visibly irritated when it's missing: the lore-literate faction. So, Krorks. Modern orcs didn't evolve from some generic green-skinned ancestor. They were engineered, more than 60 million years ago, by a reptilian alien species the lore calls the Old Ones, who appear in orc legend under the name the Brain Boys. What the Old Ones built was called a Krork, and it wasn't designed for pub brawls. Krorks were a dedicated military species, purpose-built to fight the Necrons and their Catan star god masters during a galaxy-spanning conflict the 40,000 universe calls the War in Heaven. These weren't the ramshackle salvage soldiers you see in a current edition codex. Krorks were larger, more intelligent, and operated technology comparable to a Space Marine's equipment. The Old Ones were building the most sophisticated warrior race in history, specifically to fight the most dangerous enemy in history. It didn't fully work. The Necrons proved too formidable even for the Krorks, and the Old Ones disappeared from the historical record entirely. Gone, leaving behind their creation with no mission, no master, and no institutional structure to maintain the knowledge they'd been built with. Over millions of years of leaderless existence, the Krork genome began expressing itself differently. The biological engineering that had produced large, intelligent, tactically sophisticated warriors found a new equilibrium. Smaller in the aggregate, simpler in cognition, but inexhaustibly resilient, perpetually reproductive, and constitutionally incapable of recognizing a strategic loss. What had been a precision instrument became a force of nature. The galaxy's most sophisticated biological weapons spent 60 million years slowly forgetting it was a weapon. The comedy of orc lore and the tragedy of it are the same fact. Now London, 1975. Games Workshop was founded that year by Ian Livingstone, Steve Jackson, and John Peake, 3 friends running a mail-order board game business out of a Shepherd's Bush flat. They established retail presence in Hammersmith, initially importing role-playing games for a UK market that couldn't otherwise get them. Warhammer 40,000, Rogue Trader was published in 1987, designed by Rick Priestley, born 29 March 1959, which made him 28 years old when it came out. The creative team producing this game were young British men working in London during a very specific moment in British social history. From 1979 through the late 1980s, Britain experienced accelerated deindustrialization. Coal, steel, shipbuilding, textile manufacturing. Industries that had organized working-class communities for generations were being restructured and frequently closed across a single decade. Unemployment concentrated in those communities, not as an abstraction, but as a lived neighborhood reality. And in those same years, organized football hooliganism reached a documented cultural peak. British football violence had structured itself into what the subculture called firms, Gangs affiliated with specific clubs, known by name, with recognized territories and reputations maintained through direct physical confrontation. West Ham United had the Intercity firm, active from the 1970s through the 1980s. Millwall's firm generated enough notoriety that their 1985 FA Cup quarter-final at Luton Town's ground ended in a riot that made national news and prompted parliamentary debate. Manchester United's youth gangs had operated under the Red Army name since the early 1970s. Hundreds of clubs had affiliated firms across the country, each with its own name, its own reputation, and its own internal hierarchy based purely on accumulated confrontational credibility. Sociologists studying the phenomenon documented firms as filling an identity vacuum left by industrial collapse. They provided community, hierarchy, and legible status at a moment when the institutional structures that had previously organized working-class lives were being dismantled. Margaret Thatcher's government considered the situation significant enough to establish dedicated policy responses addressing football violence specifically. Alongside the firms, a parallel aesthetic movement was emerging from the same social substrate. Casuals appeared in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a distinct look within football subculture. Designer sportswear, expensive trainers, no club colors or insignia, deliberately chosen to evade police surveillance while still signaling membership to anyone who recognized the codes. Both subcultures, punk and casual, emerged from working-class communities experiencing the same economic pressures and shared members, venues, and attitudes. The visual chaos of British punk in 1977 and 1978 was the same impulse that was wearing Lacoste polo shirts and following firms to away games by 1983. American journalist Bill Buford spent more than 8 years embedded with hooligan firms for his 1990 book, Among the Thugs. His observation about firm communication has stuck with scholars of the subject. The talking serves the same function as the fighting. Performance, assertion of presence, noise as social signal. Games Workshop's creative team were young British men who grew up watching this in the news, on terraces, and in their own neighborhoods. You don't design an alien species in London in 1987 without that cultural environment shaping what an alien mob looks like. Academic analyses of the 40K setting treat the hooligan origin not as community myth, but as established design fact running from Rogue Trader's 1987 release. Community members with deep knowledge of the game's development state it plainly. They are, after all, based on North London football firms of the 1980s. Facebook communities dedicated to 40K lore summarize it simply. English football hooligans were a huge inspiration for the early Warhammer Orcs. The mapping between hooligan culture and orc design is specific enough to run exhibit by exhibit. Football firms center their authority structure on the top boy, the recognized leader. There's no formal appointment mechanism, no charter, no external recognition. The top boy is whoever has demonstrated sufficient dominance and reputation to hold the position. Authority changes through displacement. Sociologists studying firm leadership note that organization emerges from demonstrated dominance. Leadership with no institutional backing whatsoever, produced entirely by reputation and willingness. Orc society operates by identical mechanics, and the codex is explicit about the biological mechanism. As the orc survives combats and wins trophies, the respect of other orcs will produce in him an effect somewhat similar to adolescence in the human male. He puts on muscle, becomes more aggressive and assertive, and generally throws his weight around. Orcs biologically grow larger as they win fights. The warboss is always the biggest, strongest individual in any orc group. Not because he was elected, not because of hereditary right, but because he's physically outgrown the competition through accumulated wins. Succession is explicit in the lore. The warboss holds his position until a bigger orc beats him, and the one who does the beating becomes the next warboss. Canonically, orcs never stop growing until a bigger orc beats them, meaning the oldest survivors are the largest, the largest are in charge, and the only mechanism for changing that is violence. Between the war boss and the rank-and-file boys sit the knobs, larger orcs who've survived enough violence to physically distinguish themselves from ordinary fighters, but not yet big enough to challenge for the top position. The hierarchy is a continuous size gradient organized entirely by combat success. You can't fake it. There's no paperwork that makes you a war boss. Orc domains are described in lore as not a united or cohesive organization, rather a collection of thousands of individual territories and empires. No central government, no bureaucracy, no institution of any kind. The WoW field itself communicates who is bigger and therefore in charge. Every orc within range instinctively knows the hierarchy without anyone explaining it. The WoW, as a collective force, escalates through the same pattern as a firm. A war boss wins fights, grows bigger. A bigger war boss attracts more followers. More followers generate more combat, more wins, more growth. Local warband becomes planetary assault. Planetary assault attracts more orcs wanting to join the winning side. The mob scales itself by its own social logic, the same way a firm that was 20 lads last year is 40 this year because they had a good run and more young men want in on whatever's winning. GW didn't just borrow the accent. They built the entire power structure of orc society on the same social mechanics that govern a football firm. In 1987, Rogue Trader introduced orcs to the tabletop. Within a few years, GW had done something unprecedented in fantasy gaming. They gave a non-human species a specific real-world regional dialect, rendered phonetically across all official materials. The first complete standalone orc rulebook, Ere We Go, published in 1991, was packed with Cockney slang, not as isolated flavor text, but as the operating language of the entire faction. The dialect is called Mockney by the community, Mock Cockney, or more precisely, an exaggerated estuary English working-class London register. A peer-reviewed academic localization study published on the translation of Dawn of War II, Retribution into Polish, identified Orc speech as a dialect, variant of English, in some respects also resembling Cockney, and analyzed the specific difficulties this created for translators rendering the game into other languages. The Cockney coding was systematic enough to become a professional localization problem. The phonological rules map directly onto documented features of actual working-class London speech. H-dropping turns hard into ard, and here into ear. The fronting converts with into with, and thing into thing. Dental fricatives at word endings become f. Death becomes death. Breath becomes breath. Brother becomes brother. Every plural and verb ending swaps s for z. Boys becomes boys. Guns becomes guns. Consonant clusters double up with k. Truck becomes truck. Block becomes block. Verbs ending in er become a. Shooter becomes shoota. Trigger becomes trigga. Bigger becomes bigga. Every feature in that list is a documented phonological characteristic of real Cockney and estuary English. GW didn't invent alien phonemes. They transcribed a real dialect, applied it to a fictional species, and maintained it consistently enough that the community-written Steam guide, Orc Speech 101, has accumulated 17,000 unique visitors across 6 sections of linguistic rules, a complete glossary, and detailed naming conventions. People study this. The guide opens its linguistics section by acknowledging that the entire system will work better for native UK English speakers, because that was the foundational template, and then it spends several thousand words proving it. The visual design followed the same cultural logic. Early Rogue Trader era orc miniatures, illustrated by Paul Bonner, carried chaotic and anarchic aesthetics overlapping directly with British punk. Mohawks, improvised and salvaged gear treated as personal expression, aggressive anti-establishment visual language. Sculptor Brian Nelson, brought in just prior to 3rd edition, shifted the aesthetic toward a more muscular and brutal look, but the fundamental anarchic visual identity was already established. An academic analysis published in Fantasy und Intertextualität describes the Warhammer 40,000 setting as projected over, transformed by a typically British punk culture. The punk and hooligan subcultures weren't separate phenomena in 1980s Britain. They overlapped continuously in working-class communities, with the casual fashion movement emerging from exactly the same social environment that had produced the Clash and the Sex Pistols a few years earlier. GW then made the punk inspiration explicit enough that it's in the rulebook. The Orc Codex contains a battlefield unit called the Goth Rockers, 3 orcs playing an in-universe musical genre they call Gothic rock. The name is a pun. Gothic rock is Gothic rock, spelled phonetically in the Orc dialect. Vintage metal goth rocker miniatures exist as official GW models and have been traded as collectibles for decades. These aren't fan creations or community proxies. They're official releases listed in Codex entries. GW published a working-class punk band, named them after a genre pun, manufactured physical miniatures, and gave them battlefield rules alongside the war boss. That's a design team making their cultural reference explicit enough that it's standing on your kitchen table next to the scatter dice. Now the mechanic that separates orcs from every other faction in 40K. A gathering of orcs generates a collective psychic field called the Wa. That field has measurable physical effects on material reality. The canonical formulation, if enough orcs believe something is true, it will actually become so, brought into physical existence through the combined psychic presence of the orc collective. This phenomenon was documented in-universe by an Adeptus Mechanicus researcher named Lucas Anzion, a genitor, which is roughly the Mechanicus equivalent of a xenobiologist. The theory that orc technology is psychically amplified originates specifically with Anzion's recorded observations. There is a named scientist in the 40K universe who wrote a formal report explaining why orc guns work. The report exists in the lore as a document. An in-universe academic got there before the community did. The red paint is the clearest demonstration, confirmed canonical across multiple editions. Orcs paint their vehicles red because red is the color that makes things go faster. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, this is factually true. The Wa field registers the collective orc belief that red equals speed, and red-painted orc vehicles demonstrably travel faster than identical vehicles in other colors. Previous editions modeled this with an actual additional movement bonus on the tabletop, a measurable stat change derived entirely from paint color. The Evil Sons clan has built their entire cultural identity around this principle. They're obsessed with maximum speed. They paint everything red, and by orc physics, they are correct. It's not that red vehicles go faster in general. Red makes things go faster. That's the full mechanism. The paint color is doing real physics in the 40K universe. Then the community invented a new belief, and the universe agreed. Purple is the sneakiest color, began as a community joke. If orc belief makes red vehicles faster, collective orc belief should make purple things stealthier. The idea spread until GW canonized it. Now it's established 40K lore that orcs believe purple makes them harder to see, and the Wa field makes this true. The lore further contains the proposition that blind orcs are even stealthier than purple ones, because if they can't see you, you can't see them. A community meme entered official canon because enough people believed in it. The belief tech mechanic validated itself through audience participation. Mech Boys, the orc engineers, have their own version. A mech boy doesn't learn engineering. He hasn't been taught how to build a combustion engine, a teleporter, a rocket propulsion system, or a tractor cannon that hurls war machines kilometers into the sky. The Lexicanum entry on mech boys is explicit. A mech boy knows how to create engines and generators, even though he has never been taught to do so. He builds them anyway, through instinct, because the old one's original engineering knowledge was encoded in the orc genome 60 million years ago, and it's still there, expressed as racial memory rather than education. The WA field then takes that barely functional construction and props it up with the collective belief of every orc who expects it to work. Pain boys operate on the same principle. Mad Doc Grotznick, the most famous pain boy in orc lore, is described officially as the originator of the squig brain transplant, a very popular orc elective surgery per his fandom entry. Grotznick and his colleagues perform surgery with enthusiasm rather than training, achieving results that have no clinical explanation given their technique. Orc physiology is robust, and the collective belief of every orc who expects the doc to fix them contributes psychic support to the procedure. Patient confidence isn't merely therapeutic, it's mechanically load-bearing. There's a canonical story, widely documented across lore databases, of a war boss who entered warp space after defeating an Imperial fleet, emerged before the battle had started, and engaged himself in combat. He fought his own past self, won, and took his earlier self's favorite gun as a trophy. He now owns 2 copies of his own weapon. This is presented in orc accounts as a legitimate historical event. What's notable isn't just that it happened, but that no orc who heard the story apparently found it contradictory. The war boss believed he could win a fight against himself, executed it with complete conviction, and the timeline cooperated. The important nuance, and the research is explicit about this, is that orc belief doesn't conjure things from nothing. The WA field enhances things that are plausible within orc understanding, keeps functional technology from falling apart, and occasionally bends physics in ways that wouldn't otherwise be permitted. Give an orc a log and tell him it's a rocket launcher, and nothing happens. The belief has to have a foundation, even a ridiculous one. Orc commandos, the stealth specialists, theoretically operating through cunning and misdirection rather than raw volume, have become associated in community discussion with an oversized firearm suppressor. The community reasoning, which is internally consistent with the belief text system while living primarily in community extrapolation rather than a specific codex page, runs as follows. Orc commandos believe suppressors make guns quiet, but orcs as a collective believe in DACA, maximum volume, maximum firepower, guns that are as loud and dramatic as possible. The WA field is registering 2 competing beliefs simultaneously. 11 million orcs believing guns should make as much noise as possible significantly outweigh one commando's theory about noise suppression. The suppressor makes the gun louder. Whether GW formally published this in a codex doesn't change the fact that the community immediately recognized it as exactly what orcs would do and exactly what would happen when they tried to do it. One commenter's response, "You can't hear me DACA if you deaf," pulled 186 likes on the YouTube thread that sparked this entire video. Another described an oversized orc silencer that somehow made the gun louder as the funniest single piece of orc technology they'd encountered. That reaction comes from the same place as the purple color meme. The belief tech design logic is coherent enough that people can predict new orc lore from first principles. You understand what orcs are well enough to know exactly what they do with a suppressor. The joke works because the design works. There's a canonical orc statement that belongs in the record from the Lexicanum's collection of orc philosophy. Orcs is never defeated in battle. If we win, we win. If we die fighting. So it don't count. If we runs for it, we don't die neither, 'cause we can come back for a neuver go, see? Read that as a philosophical position, and it's completely unhinged. Read it as a working-class hooligan's explanation of why he's never technically lost a fight, and it's immediately recognizable. The loss condition is defined out of existence. You either won, or you died heroically, or you're available for a rematch. The same logic keeps a firm returning to the same rivalry for decades without either side ever conceding a defeat. Then there's Warlord Killboss, facing an Imperial Warhound-class Titan, a war machine the size of a building, carrying weapons capable of leveling city blocks, delivering the following. "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but Mork'll kick your teeth in, you big bugger." That's the entire orc disposition in one line. Size is a solvable problem. Firepower is a negotiation. Conviction is the variable that actually matters. Video games proved fan appetite for this particular flavor of orc long before any YouTube comment section debate about geography. The Dawn of War series, starting in 2004 from Relic Entertainment at THQ, put full-voiced Cockney orc dialogue into a real-time strategy game played by millions. Dawn of War 2, Retribution, released in 2011, generated enough linguistic complexity that a researcher produced a peer-reviewed academic paper specifically examining how Polish translators handled the orc dialect problem, documenting orc speech as a variant of English, in some respects also resembling Cockney, and cataloging the difficulties of rendering Cockney-derived phonological humor into a language with entirely different class associations and dialect structures. You don't create an international professional translation crisis unless the source material has a genuine, systematic linguistic identity. Relic Entertainment's Space Marine, released in 2011, positioned orcs as the primary enemy faction for its entire campaign. 2 decades after Rogue Trader, orcs remained the default antagonist of choice when the 40,000 setting needed to generate an enemy that was simultaneously dangerous and immediately readable as having a consistent personality. You know what an orc wants within seconds of encountering one. That clarity of characterization is why they keep getting cast as the lead villains. On October 20th, 2022, developer Rogueside released Warhammer 40,000, Shooters, Blood, and Teeth, a 2D run-and-gun side-scrolling platformer where the player controls an orc warrior seeking revenge against someone who stole his squig. Available on PC, PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series X/S, and Nintendo Switch, Steam recorded 87% positive across 1,355 user reviews. Goddess a Geek described it as immediate, frantic fun that refuses to take itself or its bleak universe seriously. A review on Midlife Gamer Geek independently highlighted the red paint speed mechanic as a core example of what makes the faction engaging. A reviewer with no reason to think about orc belief tech as a design philosophy concept arriving there anyway, because the mechanic is that clearly the heart of what makes orcs fun to play. The community had anticipated something like Shooters, Blood, and Teeth years before Rogueside shipped it. One YouTube comment proposing an orc-centric looter shooter under the title Looters and Shooters pulled 544 likes, with replies immediately naming the real game as proof the concept worked. The fan proposal and the actual released product converged on the same fundamental premise. Orcs work as playable characters because the faction's internal logic is built around the most entertaining possible approach to every tactical problem. Guns that operate on faith. Hierarchy determined by biological mass. Technology assembled by racial instinct and sustained by collective confidence. The chaos isn't a bug. It's the design specification, documented from the first codex and running uninterrupted through 40 years of releases. New Jersey or British hooligans? British hooligans. GW was a British company, founded in London in 1975, staffed by young British men who absorbed the cultural landscape of peak football violence across the late 1970s and 1980s, and the Orc faction that emerged from that environment carries the accent, the hierarchy, the mob psychology, the relationship to violence as social bonding, and the working-class identity of a very specific British subculture coded directly into its mechanics. The Cockney dialect is documented. The codex hierarchy is a structural translation of how firms organize. The WA escalation pattern follows the same social physics as a firm expanding through a winning run. The emphasis on noise, aggression, and demonstrations of dominance over institutional authority is the hooligan ethos rendered as galaxy-spanning science fiction. But the New Jersey joke isn't stupid. Here's why it keeps pulling likes. Orc culture isn't based on a place. It's based on a human impulse, the pack, the noise, the hierarchy of whoever is currently largest and most willing, the tribal identity that doesn't require external justification. These dynamics emerge from working-class communities under economic pressure, from people whose existing social structures have been disrupted and who built their own in the space left behind. GW coded the British version because that's the version their designers lived inside during the critical creative years. But the American working-class bravado the New Jersey comparison is reaching for, the territorial neighborhood loyalty, the group identity that doesn't need an institution to back it up, the same performance of aggression as social currency, runs on the same underlying software. Every culture on Earth produces these groups. Every culture on Earth has its orcs. GW happened to give them Cockney accents and put them in space, and 40 years later the whole internet is still arguing about which side of the Atlantic they came from, in 48 reply threads, using the same kind of loud, territorial certainty that makes the joke work in the first place. The comment section is running orc social mechanics about orc social mechanics. The wah field is strong in the replies. Like the old lore says, if they win, they win. If they die fighting so it doesn't count. And if they runs for it, they don't die neither because they can come back for Anu Virgo. Du Bois never stop. Because Du Bois never technically lose. Because Du Bois get to define what counts as a loss. Subscribe for more.